Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission feels pretty straightforward. We're sinking our teeth, so to speak, into the history of the vampire myth.
Right.
And when you hear vampire, you probably picture, the classic image, pale, maybe a cape, very sophisticated, the Dracula type.
Exactly. That's the image literature gave us.
Yeah.
But the sources, the actual history, it tells a very different story. Much grislier and honestly less elegant.
So we're kind of doing an intellectual autopsy here.
That's a good way to put it. Because the vampire's history isn't just one thing. It's a real tangle of old folk beliefs, some major medical misunderstandings that genuinely terrified people, and then, yes, a lot of literary creativity layered on top.
Okay, so we'll trace that evolution. We're using sources that track this creature from its, let's say, regional roots, right up to the glamorous figure we see in media today.
And the goal is really to show that contrast, the sophisticated modern idea versus the, frankly, repulsive historical reality.
Let's dive in then. If we push aside the modern fiction, where do the sources say this whole undead idea really starts? I know there are global myths, but the vampire specifically.
Yeah, while you find blood drinkers everywhere, the creature that really develops into our modern vampire has its strongest roots in Eastern European folklore. That's sort of ground zero.
Eastern Europe, okay.
And it's important to remember, they weren't initially called vampires. Traditionally, these were seen more as revenants.
Revenants
meaning basically a corpse that returns from the grave, comes back specifically to harm the living, often draining life, which later got interpreted as blood, usually targeted family, neighbors.
Okay, right. And this is where it gets completely wild, totally different from the modern image. Because you'd think something draining life would look, well, drained itself, right? Pale, thin, gaunt.
That's the logical assumption based on the modern idea. But the actual accounts from the 17th, 18th centuries, when this fear was peaking, the descriptions are the exact opposite. Sources consistently describe the creature as bloated, robust, even ruddy-cheeked.
Bloated, ruddy. That sounds healthy. How does that make any sense for something supposedly feeding on others?
It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it makes perfect sense when you realize where they were encountering these suspected revenants.
In the grave.
Precisely. The sources show a strong link between these legends and, well, a lack of scientific understanding about death and disease back then. They didn't have medical explanations for sudden plagues or clusters of deaths in a community.
So they looked for a supernatural cause.
Exactly. And when they exhumed a body they suspected of causing the trouble, what they found looked horrifyingly alive.
What were they actually seeing, though? What made them think undead?
This is the crucial insight from the sources. They were seeing natural decomposition, but mistaking the biological effects for a supernatural cause.
Okay, walk me through that. How does decomposition make a body look bloated and ruddy?
Well, as the body decays, bacteria in the gut produce gases. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, things like that.
Right.
These gases build up and they cause the body to bloat quite significantly. So that explains the robust look. It wasn't fat, it was gas.
Okay, bloating makes sense, but ruddy, that sounds like fresh blood, like it just fed.
And that was the truly terrifying part for them. The internal pressure from those gases could force fluids out. Often dark, liquefied blood and other post-mortem fluids would be pushed up and out of the mouth, the nose.
Oh.
So the corpse would literally look like it had just fed. Blood stains on the face, the shroud. They saw this swollen, reddish-faced body, blood around the mouth, and the conclusion was obvious to them. Not dead, active, feeding.
That's incredibly grim. So the monster wasn't really supernatural, it was just misunderstood biology.
Fundamentally, yes. A terrifying misunderstanding.
So this creature, born from fear and bad science, is mainly an Eastern European thing initially. But how did it cross over? When did we start calling it a vampire?
That term, vampire, it enters the English language surprisingly late, around 1732.
1732, that's quite recent in the grand scheme.
It is. And it didn't come from, say, scholarly translation. It exploded into public awareness because of sensational reports.
News reports. What was going on in the 18th century that was so dramatic, it introduced this word to the West?
Well, the term got popularized by a whole wave of really detailed and quite frightening reports coming out of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This was during the peak of what historians call the vampire hysteria in the 18th century.
Hysteria, like mass panic.
Oh, absolutely. Real social panic. Intense fear sweeping through communities.
But if the evidence was just decomposition, why did the panic get so bad? Why did it last so long and spread? Were there other factors? Politics, maybe?
Definitely. The hysteria was particularly strong in the borderlands of the Habsburg Empire. These were areas with a lot of political flux. You had the Habsburgs and the Ottomans vying for control.
Ah, instability.
Right. And imperial authorities were often trying to standardize things, like burial practices, sometimes clashing with local traditions. So when epidemics hit and traditional methods failed, the old fear of the revenant provided an explanation people understood, something they felt they could act on.
And the action they took, it was pretty extreme, wasn't it? What do the sources say people actually did?
Driven by this intense fear, they resorted to grave diggings, widespread exhumations, and then ritualistically staking the corpses they believed were responsible, or other methods of neutralizing the body.
Taking. Just like in the movies.
Well, the movies got it from somewhere. One of the most famous cases that really brought this whole thing to Western attention was Arnold Pale in Serbia back in the 1720s.
Arnold Pale, I think I've heard that name. He was supposedly killed by a vampire, died, and then people started dying in his village.
That's the story. And the official reports about digging up Hale and others, those are what really caught the eye of Enlightenment thinkers in Vienna, London, Paris.
What did the reports say they found?
The classic signs we just talked about. The official Austrian military reports noted his body looks remarkably preserved, not decayed like expected. And his coffin was supposedly wet with fresh blood.
Which was really just...
likely those decomposition fluids we discussed, maybe some environmental moisture, preservation due to soil conditions. But to the people there, it looked like proof positive. He was feeding.
It's a perfect storm of misinterpretation. The body looks active because of natural processes, so they stake it to stop it.
Exactly. Cause and effect completely flipped.
Okay, so this historical fear eventually fuels literary fascination. We have this frankly disgusting peasant monster, product of fear and misunderstood biology. How does it become, suave? When does it put on the tuxedo?
That shift from folk horror to sophisticated villain, that's probably the biggest transformation in the whole myth. Literature gave the vampire a complete makeover, a real glow up, as you said earlier.
And this starts pretty early in the 19th century. This is where the aristocratic version comes in.
Yes, absolutely. The modern idea, the charismatic, seductive blood drinker, that's almost purely a literary invention. It really kicks off with John Polidori's novella The Vampire, published in 1819.
Polidori, right, that came out of the same sort of circle as Frankenstein, didn't it?
It did. Lord Byron, Mary Shelley. Polidori was Byron's physician. His character, Lord Ruthven, he was the prototype, an aristocratic predator using charm and status to prey on the innocent.
So Polidori ditched the whole decomposition thing.
Completely. Ruthven wasn't a bloated corpse climbing out of a village grave. He was an alluring, dangerous figure moving in high society. It shifted the commentary from fear of death to maybe fear of the predatory upper classes.
A social commentary, almost.
Very much so. The monster became less about local plagues and more about status, seduction, the abuse of power. It tapped into romantic and later Victorian anxieties about foreign nobles, hidden dangers, maybe even sexual corruption.
Okay, so Polidori creates the aristocratic template. But the specific roles, the mythology, we all know coffins, no sunlight, immortality. Where does that get cemented?
Well, that's largely down to one book. Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897.
The big one.
The definitive one. Stoker took Polidori's aristocratic predator concept, refined it, added layers of folklore, some real, some maybe invented, and created this iconic figure. Count Dracula embodied so many late Victorian fears. Fear of the foreigner, reverse colonization, moral decay, the clash between modernity and ancient superstition.
It's amazing how literature just completely rebranded the creature.
Oh.
From embodying natural decay and disease.
Right, uncontrolled chaos.
To embodying this very controlled, focused, almost seductive evil.
Precisely. And if you look at the whole arc, these literary works took a regional folk belief born from very specific myth-understood circumstances and transformed it into this global icon of horror. It shows how myths evolve, right? Ancient fears, local beliefs, scientific misunderstandings, and literary genius all get mixed together, remixed for each new era's anxieties.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We started our deep dive thinking about Count Dracula, elegant immortal.
The familiar image.
And we dug through the sources and found his ancestor was this, bloated, ruddy revenant. A creature literally born from the fear of decomposing bodies and unexplained deaths.
And that contrast is really the key takeaway, isn't it? Understanding the why behind the myth is so important. The vampire story is this powerful example of how humans create cultural explanations. Monsters, often for natural processes they don't understand. Decomposition, disease,
Yeah.
even social upheaval.
Yeah.
It's a way to make sense of the scary and inexplicable.
So here's a final thought. Building on that link between the historical fear and misunderstood biology in the sources, if that intense panic about the undead grew directly from misinterpreting natural bodily changes, what anxieties do we have today? What things feel terrifyingly inexplicable now that maybe 50 or 100 years from now, people will look back and see were rooted in our own misunderstandings of science or biology, or maybe complex social systems we just don't grasp yet?
That's a fascinating question.
Something for you to think about. Next time a monster seems to offer an easy explanation for something complex and frightening. Okay, when you hear vampire, I bet your mind jumps straight to, Gothic castles, maybe some myths, lots of drama. We generally think of it as fiction, right? Pure entertainment. But today we're setting aside the capes, the melodrama, and we're diving deep into a specific historical moment, a time when people officially, genuinely believed their neighbors were, rising from the grave. We're talking about the European vampire panic, the big one in the 18th century.
Yeah, it was terrifyingly real for the people experiencing it.
And this wasn't just like isolated village stories. It was huge. It spread across big parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. A lot of it centered around the borderlands of the Habsburg Empire, actually. So our mission today is to really unpack this. What was the unique mix of things, the culture, the social stuff, the science or lack thereof that let this happen? How did a local superstition basically turn into this continent-wide freakout?
It's such a fascinating period because it highlights this kind of historical paradox, doesn't it? This panic didn't flare up in, say, the Dark Ages, which you might expect. It actually peaked right at the dawn of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason.
Right. Seems completely counterintuitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what our research shows, what the sources really point to, is this dangerous combination. On one hand, you had a profound lack of modern scientific understanding, particularly about the human body after death. But paired with that was this new, intense Enlightenment curiosity. People wanted rational explanations for things they couldn't explain.
Okay.
But that impulse to investigate, often without the proper tools or knowledge, actually ended up amplifying the fear instead of debunking it. It's a case study in, scientific transition, really.
And one of the really striking things we found in the sources is how it spread. The roots are definitely in old folklore, no doubt, but the spread was surprisingly modern. You had officials actually documenting supposed supernatural events, and then the media, early newspapers and pamphlets just ran with it, sensationalized it.
It became official news, in a way. And that's how fear really travels when it gets that stamp of authority.
Okay, so let's dig into that. You can't have a panic like this without a clear villain figure. To set the scene, what did the traditional folklore in these areas actually say? Who or what were they afraid of?
Well, the term often used in the records is revenant. It's Latin, basically means one who returns.
Returns from the grave.
Yes, exactly. These weren't seen as ghosts, not just spirits. They were described as physical, tangible beings that literally climbed out of their graves. Corporeal.
And what did people believe they did? What was their MO?
The sources consistently mention two main things. Sucking blood, which is the classic image we still have.
Right.
But maybe even more terrifying for a pre-modern community, they were seen as direct bringers of disease and death, like agents of plague.
Ah, okay, so that establishes a direct link.
A critical one.
Yeah.
If a mysterious illness swept through your livestock, or if family members started dying suddenly without a clear cause, the revenant became the explanation. The returned dead did it.
So the undead and unexplained sickness became tied together.
Absolutely. And that belief, that connection, solidified the need for, pretty extreme actions.
And this is where things really take a turn, isn't it? Because the folklore provided the framework, the idea of the revenant.
Right.
But the real engine driving the panic, the thing that made people believe they were seeing evidence, was a huge misunderstanding of basic biology. Let's unpack that. What actually happens to a body after death that, to an 18th century observer, looked exactly like vampirism?
This is absolutely the core of it. People just didn't have the scientific context for decomposition as we understand it now.
What did they expect to happen?
Well, after rigor mortis, the thinking was kind of that the body would just lie still and sort of neatly decay, maybe dry out. They didn't have a concept of the, frankly, quite violent internal processes of putrefaction.
Yeah, putrefaction isn't exactly neat and tidy.
Not at all. It's driven by internal bacteria breaking down tissues. This produces a lot of gas, methane, hydrogen sulfide, things like that. And these gases cause the body, especially the abdomen and the face, to bloat up quite dramatically. And that pressure, the bloating, forces fluids out. Blood, other decomposing fluids. They get pushed out of the body's orifices. The mouth, the nose.
So let me picture this. Someone exhumes a body maybe a few weeks, maybe a month after burial.
Yeah.
And they find it looking, well, not skeletal. It looks kind of plump, maybe bloated. The skin might be dark, purplish. And crucially, there's this dark fluid, what looks like blood around the mouth and nose.
Precisely. And they also didn't understand things like gastric purging, that fluids remaining in the stomach could be forced up the esophagus by the gas pressure.
So it literally looked like the corpse had been drinking blood recently.
To them, yes.
Okay.
It looked like fresh, recent ingestion.
Yeah.
Imagine you're in a village, people are dying mysteriously, you're desperate for answers.
Yeah.
You dig up the suspected culprit, and you see that. It looked like definitive proof.
Proof that the deceased hadn't just died, they were somehow thriving, feeding in the grave.
Thriving on the life force of the living. That was the interpretation. And that belief, that visual proof, is what justified the really quite shocking things they did next.
And that interpretation, the idea that the body wasn't truly dead, but just sort of sleeping and feeding,
Right.
that led directly to some horrifying rituals, didn't it? What did the sources say they did to try and stop these supposed revenants?
You see a clear escalation in the accounts. First step was usually just digging the body up to check. Exhumation.
Okay.
They saw those signs we just talked about, the bloating, the blood. The next common step was staking. Driving a sharpened wooden stake, often hawthorn or ash, through the chest or heart.
The classic movie scene. But the intention was?
To physically pin the body to the earth. To stop it from rising again. Maybe also seen as piercing the source of its unnatural life.
And if that didn't seem to work, or if the fear was really high?
Then things got more extreme. Decapitation was common. The idea was to completely sever the connection between the, let's say, spirit or animating force and the body itself. Cut off the head, it can't function. And often, as a final measure, the body parts, head, torso, limbs, would be burned to ashes. Complete destruction was seen as the only guaranteed way to stop it permanently. Annihilation.
Wow. It's almost like a form of practical problem solving, but based on a completely misunderstood premise, like empirical science driven by superstition.
In a way, yes. They were observing a physical phenomena, the strange state of the corpse, the ongoing deaths, and applying the most decisive interventions they knew, which were rooted in these ritualistic beliefs.
Yeah.
Trying to solve a visible problem with the tools they had.
So, okay, these are intense, terrifying, very local events happening in villages. How did this escalate? How did it go from a village graveyard issue to something that leaders in like Vienna or Prague actually had to deal with? What role did local authorities play in maybe inadvertently spreading the panic?
This transition is crucial. It's where bureaucracy kind of crashes into folklore. And it's fascinating. What happened was when these death clusters got bad enough, local officials, magistrates, sometimes military officers stationed nearby, or even clergy would be called in to investigate.
To figure out why so many people were dying.
Exactly. And they started documenting these events, creating official reports about these so-called vampire cases. Now, initially, it wasn't always driven by pure superstition on their part. Sometimes it was just paperwork. They needed an official explanation for why the mortality rate in this village suddenly spiked, or why this plague wouldn't go away. It could destabilize the community, affect taxes, troop levies.
So they needed a reason on file.
They needed a record. But in doing so, they were creating a legitimate bureaucratic paper trail for the monster.
Huh. So the simple act of writing it down, putting it in an official report with signatures and seals, that gave the revenant a kind of legitimacy, even for the educated classes.
It absolutely did. You have to appreciate the power of the written official document in that era. Once these reports existed detailing the exhumation, the condition of the body, the fresh blood, the lack of decay, they started to circulate.
How did they circulate?
Well, this wasn't the internet age, obviously, but reports were copied, they were passed around, they were sometimes published as official pamphlets, discussed in the emerging academic journals of the time, and definitely picked up by early newspapers across Europe.
Okay, so once it hits print, even that early form of media,
It catches fire. It captures the public imagination. What started as maybe a regional health crisis, or a series of them, gets transformed into this broader European obsession, a genuine panic.
Because the details would have been pretty sensational, right?
Well, highly sensationalized. We have documented cases, like the famous one of Arnold Powell. I think he was Serbian.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that name.
His official report, compiled by Habsburg officials, explicitly notes the body was found plump, ruddy, and showed unmistakable signs of recent feeding. Now, if you're an educated person in Vienna reading that in an official document signed by a magistrate and maybe a military surgeon, even if you're skeptical about folktales, you have to grapple with it. It demands attention.
Which brings us right to the biggest twist in this whole story, doesn't it? The paradox. The role of the Enlightenment itself. This was supposed to be the age of challenging old superstitions with reason, with science. So why on earth did the age of rationality end up feeding the very monster it should have killed off?
It's perhaps the most powerful takeaway from this whole episode in history. The Enlightenment wasn't just about having reason, it was about applying it. It actively encouraged what they called natural philosophy, basically, the scientific investigation of everything, all phenomena.
Okay.
So when these reports started coming in these official documents describing bloody, seemingly undecayed corpses, the intellectual community and even imperial authorities like Empress Maria Theresa decided they had to investigate properly. Scientifically.
They weren't just dismissing the claims out of hand.
No, quite the opposite. They were trying to apply the new rational methods to this very old, very frightening problem. They thought, let's get to the bottom of this using observation and reason.
So they actually sent people out, commissioned teams.
Yes. Teams, often including physicians, surgeons, official delegates, they were sent to the villages, instructed to exhume the suspected bodies again, conduct examinations, and deliver a definitive scientific verdict on this whole vampire business.
But the tragedy was in what they didn't know.
Precisely. Their intentions were rational, but their toolkit was incomplete. These early investigators, however educated for their time, lacked modern pathology. They didn't understand germ theory. And crucially, they didn't have our complete understanding of biological decomposition.
So they went in looking for objective evidence.
And their objective observations seemed to confirm the villagers' fears. They saw the same things the villagers saw.
The bloating, the fluids, the apparent lack of decay compared to, say, a skeleton.
Right, they lacked the scientific context to say, that's natural putrefaction causing gas buildup and fluid expulsion. Instead, they look at a body bloated with gases and dutifully record that the corpse was full of fluid blood, meaning it hadn't dried out as expected. They'd observe the post-mortem purging from the mouth and nose and record it as evidence of recent meals or feeding. Because they had no good alternative scientific explanation for why a body might look relatively fresh months after death, their official reports, which were meant to be objective and rational,
ended up inadvertently validating the whole superstition.
Exactly. They tried to be rational investigators, applying the best science they had. But because that science was incomplete, they effectively poured fuel on the fire. They intensified the craze they were supposed to debunk.
Wow. So the search for reason, guided by incomplete knowledge, actually strengthened the belief in the supernatural. That really is the historical punchline here.
It is. And if we synthesize all this, pull together what the sources are telling us for you, the listener, it becomes clear. The 18th century vampire hysteria wasn't just some random madness. It was a kind of perfect storm created by 4 specific things weaving together.
Okay, what are they?
First, you absolutely need the foundation. Those deep-seated traditional folk beliefs about the revenant, the returning dead.
Right, the basic concept.
Second, the pervasive, powerful, and very real fear of disease. Epidemics, unexplained deaths. These were constant threats that demanded explanation.
Got it.
Third, and this is maybe the most crucial driver, that disastrous misinterpretation of natural phenomena. Specifically, the normal, if gruesome, process of bodily decay.
The biological misunderstanding?
Yes. And finally, fourth, the amplifying and legitimizing force of bureaucracy and media sensationalism. The official reports, the pamphlets, the newspapers that took local fears and made them widespread. So the big aha moment here, talking about it for you listening, is realizing this massive European panic wasn't really caused by people being unwilling to think rationally. It was almost the opposite. It was fueled by that very Enlightenment impulse, the fervent search for verifiable, rational explanations. But because of that critical knowledge gap in their understanding of biology, that search for reason ended up reinforcing the exact superstitions it was trying to eliminate. It's a stark reminder, isn't it, that knowledge, or the search for it, is only truly powerful when it's comprehensive enough for the problem at hand.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing these sources and helping us unpack this truly wild intersection of history, science, and mass fear. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure. It really is a compelling case study. And maybe I can leave you, the listener, with one final thought, sort of building on this historical lesson.
Please do.
If the core problem back then, in the 18th century, was this widespread misinterpretation of a completely natural process decomposition simply because of a gap in scientific knowledge, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What pervasive social narrative or maybe widely accepted fear might we be reinforcing today? Something that future generations with more complete data or a better scientific understanding might look back on and see as just a simple, understandable misunderstanding based on the limits of our current knowledge.
That's a really provocative question, how history kind of forces us to stay critical about our own assumptions.
Exactly. Food for thought. Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, so we're taking your source material on regional differences in vampire folklore and launching ourselves on, well, kind of a global mythology tour today.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? When most people hear vampire, they immediately picture that literary stereotype.
The cape, the castle.
Exactly. The elegant, pale, maybe brooding aristocrat. But that image, the one Hollywood loves, it's actually remarkably recent.
Really?
Yeah, it's almost a cultural outlier, something really refined by Western literature much later on. Okay,
so that's the key thing we need to nail down today. Our mission really is to get way beyond that sort of polished, romantic Dracula figure and explore the real global picture. We want to figure out how all these different cultures, totally separate sometimes, came up with creatures that, came back from the grave to prey on people.
Right.
We're looking for those moments where you go, aha. Understanding how specific contexts like history, religion, local fears really shaped the monsters people imagined.
And the sources we looked at show the differences are, well, they're stark. It's not just little tweaks here and there.
Okay.
We're talking fundamental changes. The creature's actual form, why it preys on people, what it symbolized in that culture, and crucially, how people tried to stop it.
So where do we start? What's the launching point?
We have to start where the idea really took root, where it seems most influential. That's Eastern Europe.
Right, the classic origin.
Yeah.
So let's dive into that original blueprint, the Slavic tradition.
Yeah.
It sounds like these first vampires were, well, maybe way more terrifying than we think.
Oh, absolutely. Forget the charm, forget the elegance. This wasn't about seduction. It was rooted in public health scares.
Yeah.
The original Eastern European vampire, the sources describe it as a bloated, corpse-like being.
Bloated, not pale and gaunt.
No, quite the opposite sometimes. A literal body that rose up because it hadn't decomposed properly, and its existence was blamed for illness, death, even crop failures in the community. It wasn't just spooky, it was like a plague carrier.
Wow. So the fear wasn't just, oh no, I might get bitten. It was more like a community-wide terror. Fear of disease, fear that the dead weren't staying dead.
Precisely. That the boundary was breached. And the signs they looked for were really physical, tied directly to digging up the suspected body.
Okay, so what were they looking for?
Well, if they suspected vampirism, they'd exhume the corpse. The main thing was a lack of decomposition. The body just hadn't rotted like it should have.
Right.
And crucially, they often reported finding fresh blood around the mouth. That was taken as proof, that it had been feeding recently.
Okay, that makes a kind of gruesome sense.
Yeah.
But I'm stuck on something else. Your sources mentioned this ruddy or florid complexion. It completely flips the script on the pale vampire we all know. Why would an undead corpse look flushed?
It's a fascinating detail, isn't it? The thinking seems to be that the blood it consumed was keeping it sort of full or alive looking, almost circulating.
So the opposite of anemic.
Exactly. The total opposite of the Western idea. Imagine being a villager back then, dealing with plagues, high infant mortality. And you dig up a relative who looks bloated and, well, healthier than they should. It would be terrifying.
The ultimate sign that something was deeply wrong with the natural order.
Right. And it demanded an immediate, very physical solution.
Which gets us to the prevention methods.
Yeah.
Since the threat was so physical, this non-rotting corpse, the defenses had to be just as direct strict and, well, brutal.
Yeah, they were. The remedies really reflected how serious the threat felt to the whole village. You see the classic stuff like staking the corpse, usually through the heart, but also things like complete decapitation, separating the head from the body, its source of power. And in many areas, they'd resort to completely burning the corpse.
The total annihilation.
Pretty much. The logic was clear. Destroy the physical threat, restore order. This really gruesome physical reality is the foundation that everything else kind of built on or reacted against.
It's a really powerful starting point, that bloated ghoul. So how did we get from that in Eastern Europe to, the sophisticated, almost romantic killer we see later in Western Europe? That's a huge leap.
It is, and that takes us west. The change is really profound because the context shifts. It moves away from that communal physical fear towards more individual, maybe psychological or social anxieties.
Okay.
So in places like Germany, the British Isles, the vampire legends that developed later were often more varied, more symbolic.
And the sources suggest it wasn't always just a reanimated corpse anymore in the West, right? Sometimes the idea got mixed up with other supernatural figures.
Exactly. That's a key point. The definition kind of broadened out. Western legends sometimes linked vampirism not just to the undead, but to things like witches or evil spirits.
Oh, okay.
It became a more general term for some kind of evil force preying on the living, sometimes linked to nightmares like succubi or incubi. It blurs the line between a physical body coming back and a more spiritual attack.
And this ambiguity, this shift towards the symbolic, that must have paved the way for the biggest change of all the literary vampire.
Absolutely. That's where the monster gets, well, refined, you could say.
Refined? How so?
The transformation from sheer horror to something more like seduction really happened on the page. It reflects the thinking of the Enlightenment Victorian society. When writers brought the vampire into literature, famously starting with John Polidori's The Vampire back in 1819.
Right, Lord Ruthven.
Yes. Polidori basically stripped away the peasant horror roots and made the vampire an aristocrat. Ruthven was wealthy, charming, preying on high society. It became a kind of commentary on, aristocratic danger, sexual predation maybe.
So completely different from worrying about village plagues.
Totally divorced from it. The figure got cleaned up, elevated, and then of course Bram Stoker comes along later in the century with Dracula. He perfects this trend.
Even though Dracula's roots are in Eastern Europe.
Geographically, yes. But the character himself, he's pretty much a Western social creation. He represents anxieties about foreignness, about sex, about the decline of the aristocracy. He's got this tragic allure, psychological depth.
Not just a bloated corpse causing problems.
Not at all. And that literary refinement is why the West, and now basically the whole world, tends to picture the vampire as this seductive, complex figure.
So Western culture kind of took the basic Eastern European concept and held it up as a mirror to its own anxieties. That's quite a shift. Okay, let's move south now, geographically speaking, into regions where these ideas didn't just change, but sort of mashed together. The Mediterranean and the Balkans.
Yeah, the zone of blended monsters, as you put it. This area is just a crossroads of cultures, Orthodox Christianity, Ottoman influences, ancient Greek myths lingering.
Okay.
So it makes total sense that vampirism didn't just arrive fully formed. It went through what scholars call syncretism. It merged, blended with supernatural traditions that were already there.
Can you give us some specific examples from the sources? What do these hybrid creatures look like?
Well, two great examples are the Greek Vrikolakas and the Balkan Strigoi.
Okay, Vrikolakas and Strigoi.
Yeah. They both share that core idea of someone returning from the dead or maybe being cursed. But the Vrikolakas, for instance, often seems to keep more of its former self. It might move around, talk, interact in ways that make it more subtly dangerous than just a mindless ghoul.
More insidious.
Kind of. And the Strigoi, on the other hand, is often tied directly to witchcraft. It could be a living witch causing trouble or someone who becomes this malicious spirit after death.
So the nature of the threat keeps evolving. We went from raw physical fear to psychological anxieties, and now we're looking at things like spiritual contagion, curses. Does that change how people fought back?
Oh, absolutely. While maybe you still needed physical measures like staking sometimes, the spiritual context in the Balkans and Mediterranean meant you often needed more religious interventions.
Right.
The methods become less about just destroying the body and more about spiritual containment or purification.
And is this where we really see those famous tools from modern vampire stories start to become common? The things that aren't just about digging up bodies.
Exactly. This is where you see things like garlic being used widely for protection, or the power attributed to holy water. and the absolute necessity of specific religious rites, often performed by priests.
So you need spiritual weapons to fight a spiritual enemy.
Pretty much. It's a really crucial step in how the myth evolved. The battle moves from just the graveyard into like the moral and spiritual realm.
That's a critical transition. We've gone from a physical ghoul to a glamorous predator to a spiritual foe needing exorcism. Okay, but our global tour isn't over. We need to look beyond Europe entirely. Let's head to Asia. This seems to introduce a really fundamental difference in what these creatures are even after.
Yes, and this raises a really core question, doesn't it? If a culture doesn't primarily link fatal attacks to blood loss, what does its monster consume instead?
And the sources point strongly towards Asian folklore here, specifically the Chinese jiangshi, the hopping vampire.
That's the one, the jiangshi. Now, it is a reanimated corpse, so functionally it's similar in some ways to the Eastern European revenant.
Oh.
But what it feeds on is totally different, and it's rooted in Chinese cosmology beliefs about the body and the universe. The jiangshi doesn't suck blood, it sucks life energy, qi.
Qi. Okay, for listeners maybe not familiar with that concept, can you quickly explain why sucking qi would be so terrifying in that cultural context? What does losing qi mean?
Well, qi, in simple terms, is the vital life force. It's breath. It's the energy that animates everything, people, nature, the cosmos. So if the European vampire attacks the physical body by draining blood, the jiangshi attacks something deeper, the very foundation of your being, your soul, your vitality. Losing qi isn't just physical death. It's like existential emptiness, a complete disconnect from the life force of the universe.
Wow. That's a profound difference. And the jiangshi also have those very specific physical traits, right? Things we don't usually see in Western vampires. The sources mention its very distinct stiff movement. Why hops? Right. Why the stiffness?
Yeah, the stiffness. It's often linked to rigor mortis setting in, or maybe the idea that the corpse wasn't properly prepared for burial, so its joints are locked. And its vulnerabilities are also very specific, like it often can't bend its limbs easily, might be afraid of running water, or susceptible to certain Taoist charms or talismans.
All rooted in local beliefs.
Completely. It makes the jiangshi uniquely Chinese. You could never mistake it for Dracula. It's a fantastic example of how local metaphysics dictates the monster's rules.
Absolutely. And while the jiangshi is maybe the most famous example, the sources do mention that this idea of energy sucking isn't just in East Asia, right?
That's right. If you look more broadly, you find traditions in parts of Africa and among some Native American peoples that feature spirits or beings that consume vitality or breath or life essence rather than blood.
So, similar theme, different substance.
Exactly. They share that core theme, the dead, or something like them, preying on the living, but these figures arose independently, operating under their own cultural logic and rules. The underlying fear might be universal, but the shape the monster takes is always intensely local.
Wow. Okay, so we've really circled the globe here, haven't we? Tracing how this one core idea just warps and changes. It's so clear that what defines a vampire really just depends on what a particular society is most afraid of at the time.
That really is the main takeaway, isn't it? We started with that visceral, bloated corpse back in Eastern Europe, a reflection of fears about plague, about decomposition gone wrong, and that became the sort of baseline, the origin for the global standard, even if it got changed later.
Right. Then we saw it get transformed by Western literature into this elegant, almost romantic symbol of social anxieties, of seduction.
Then we moved south to the Balkans and Mediterranean, where it became more of a spiritual entity blended with local folklore needing religious countermeasures.
And finally, all the way to Asia, where the creature ditches blood entirely and goes for life energy, qi, reflecting a totally different way of understanding life and death.
So ultimately, yes, Eastern Europe gave us the most influential source for that classic blood-drinking narrative that went global. But when you actually look at the world's myths, the vampire label is almost just a container.
A container?
Yeah, a framework people use to talk about whatever specific fear they have about life, death, energy, vitality, whatever that culture is wrestling with. The world's folklore is just so much richer and weirder than Dracula alone would ever suggest.
That's perfectly put. Okay, so since we've really established how cultural beliefs shape whether a creature sucks blood, like in Eastern Europe, or life energy, like in Asia, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. What specific cultural context, or maybe religious belief, determines what kind of life force a monster targets? And maybe thinking about today, if a modern society fears, say, technological burnout or maybe information overload, what specific kind of energy would its unique monster consume?
Definitely something to chew on. Until our next deep dive,